Professor Velshara stood in the grand examination chamber and looked at the humans sitting across from her with cold silver eyes that had seen 3,000 years. It passed by like moments in time, and she was not impressed by what she saw before her. Now, because humans were new to space travel and new to the galactic community, and they seemed so very primitive compared to the elder races, who had built civilizations when Earth was still covered in ice and dinosaurs, the elf woman was tall and graceful with pointed ears and long white hair that flowed down. Her back like a waterfall of moonlight, and she wore robes that shimmered with power from ancient magic woven into every thread, and beside her was Ashanter, her dragon companion, who had scales that looked like someone had captured starlight and frozen it into armor across his massive body, and together they had tested hundreds of species over the centuries and decided which ones could join the Stellar Academic Council and which ones would stay primitive forever. The human was a young woman named Claire Martinez, and she wore simple clothes that looked plain and boring compared to the magnificent robes that Velshara wore, and she had brown hair tied back in a simple style and brown eyes that seemed calm, even though she was being judged by beings who could decide the fate of her entire species. And Velshara found that calmness annoying because most species showed fear, or at least respect, when they came before. The council examiners Velshar gestured with one elegant hand, and holographic images appeared in the air between them, showing complex mathematical equations that floated and glowed with soft blue light, and these equations were the test that every species had to pass before they could be accepted into the galactic community, and the test measured how well a species understood the fundamental laws of physics and mathematics that governed reality itself. Claire looked at the equations without any visible reaction on her face, and she pulled out a small device and began working through the problems, while Velshara watched with growing disapproval, because the way humans approached mathematics was so crude and inelegant compared to the beautiful methods that the elder races used, and it was like watching someone try to paint a masterpiece with a broken stick instead of a fine brush. After an hour, Claire finished and submitted her answers, and Velshara reviewed them with Ashanter, who rumbled deep in his chest as they examined the work together through their mental connection that allowed elf and dragon to share thoughts as easily as humans might share words, and what they saw confirmed everything Velshara had already believed. About humans, the mathematics were wrong, or at least they were crude and brutish, and showed a fundamental misunderstanding of how dimensional physics actually worked, because humans tried to force solutions through raw computational power instead of using the elegant principles that made the universe flow like music. And Velshara felt almost sad because she had hoped that humans might surprise her, but they had not. Velshara stood, and her voice rang out with the authority of centuries when she spoke and said that the human mathematics were incorrect and fundamentally flawed, that humanity tried to brute force solutions where elegance and understanding were required, and therefore humanity was denied advancement into the galactic community and would remain isolated on their primitive worlds until they learned to think properly. Most species would have begged or argued or shown some kind of emotional reaction to being rejected like this, because it meant their entire civilization would be cut off from the advanced technology and knowledge of the elder races, and they would be left to struggle alone in the dark corners of space. But Claire did not beg or argue or show any strong emotion at all. Instead, Claire reached into her bag and pulled out something that made Ashanter actually laugh in his deep dragon voice that echoed through the chamber, because what Claire had pulled out was a notebook made of paper, which was so primitive that most species had stopped using physical books thousands of years ago, and the idea that a species being tested for galactic advancement would bring paper to the examination was almost funny. Claire opened the notebook and placed it on the table between them and looked at Velshara with those calm brown eyes and spoke in a quiet voice that somehow carried weight despite its softness, and she said, just 2 words that would change everything that was about to happen. Turned the Pagi. Velshara stared at the human and felt confusion for the first time in centuries, because what did that mean, and why would turning a page in a primitive paper notebook matter when the human had already failed the test? And Claire must have seen the confusion on the elf woman's face, because she Explained in that same calm voice, the equations that Velshara had just reviewed were old human mathematics from 50 years ago. And humans kept that old math in their textbooks to show students where they had started from, but it was not where humanity was now, and if Velshara wanted to see current human mathematics, she needed to turn the page and look at what humans had developed more. Recently, Velsha felt something cold settle in her chest, because this seemed impossible in species. Did not advance their fundamental mathematics in just 50 years. Because that kind of progress took centuries or even millennia, and she had seen civilizations rise and fall, and none of them had ever made that kind of leap in such a short time. But something about the way Claire sat there so calm and confident made Velshara reach out with her mental powers and flip the paper page. What she saw on the next page made her breath catch in her throat, and her silver eyes went wide with shock. Because the equations written there were unlike anything in the Council's vast archives that contained the mathematical knowledge of 100 elder races spanning thousands of years, and these human equations were chaotic and aggressive and built on principles that seemed almost insane at first glance. But as Velshara traced the logic of the equations with her mind, she realized something terrifying, and the equations worked, and they did not just work, they worked better than the elegant methods that the elder races had perfected over millennia, and the human approach was like comparing a surgical laser to a finely sharpened blade. Because both could cut, but one had power that the other could never match. Velshara looked up at Claire, and her voice shook slightly when she spoke, and demanded to know how this was possible, because humanity had only discovered industrial technology 300 years ago, and had only developed advanced mathematics for barely 200 years, and yet here was mathematical theory that surpassed anything the Council had ever seen. Claire's answer was simple and direct, and she said that humans were very good at learning and adapting to new challenges, and then she paused and added something else that made the temperature in the room seem to drop by several degrees, and she said that humans were also very good at war. Enter rose to his full height, and his massive form filled the examination chamber, and his wings spread wide enough to cast shadows across the walls, and his mental voice thundered through both their minds, asking if the human dared to threaten the stellar academic council which had ruled the known galaxies for 3,000 years with absolute authority. But Claire did not flinch or show any fear, even with an ancient dragon looming over her. And she said that she was not making any threat at all, and was simply stating a fact about human nature, and Velshara had asked humans to prove they understood physics, and they did understand physics very well, but Velshara had been looking at the mathematics that humans showed to children in schools. Real calculations that humans used for their weapons and defensive shields and military ships were quite a bit more advanced than what Velshara had just reviewed, and Claire said this in the same calm tone she had used throughout the entire examination, as if discussing something as ordinary as the weather, instead of revealing that humanity had been hiding their true capabilities. Vels felt her hands trembling slightly, and she demanded that Claire show her these advanced human calculations immediately, because she needed to understand what humanity was really capable of, and whether they posed a danger to the established order of the galaxy. Claire nodded and pulled out a data device and activated it, and holographic displays sprang up around the examination chamber, showing layer after layer of complex mathematics and physics. That made Velshara's mind reel, because what she was seeing changed everything she thought she knew about this primitive species from Earth. The holographic displays filled the examination chamber with light and showed calculations that made Velshara's ancient mind struggle to comprehend what she was seeing, because humanity had not just developed faster than light travel like she had thought, but had actually weaponized the fundamental forces of space-time itself in ways that the elder races had never even considered possible. Claire stood and walked through the floating equations, pointing at different sections as she explained in simple terms what each system could do, and her voice remained calm and matter-of-fact, as if she was discussing ordinary technology instead of weapons that could reshape reality, and Velshara listened with growing horror as the true picture of human military capability became clear. The first system Claire showed was something humans called gravity well generators, and these devices could create localized distortions in space-time that would crush enemy vessels like tin cans being stepped on by a giant, and the mathematics behind it used principles that the Council had declared theoretically impossible 3 centuries ago. But here were humans making it work, and deploying it on their warships. Shenter moved closer to examine the equations, and his massive dragon head tilted as he studied the work, and his mental voice rumbled through their connections, saying that this was crude but effective, like a club made of star matter, and it would be devastatingly powerful against any ship that got caught in its field. And Velshara had to agree, even though she did not want to admit it. Claire moved to the next display and showed armor systems that human soldiers wore into combat, and this armor did something that should have been pure fantasy, because it phased the wearer partially out of normal reality, so that energy weapons and even some physical projectiles would pass right through them, like they were ghosts. And the power requirements for such technology had been impossible for a species as young as humanity, but somehow they had made it work. The mathematics for the phasing armor used quantum principles that even the most advanced Council scientists barely understood, and humans had turned those theoretical concepts into practical battlefield technology. And Velshara realized that humanity had been studying Council scientific papers and had learned from them, and then had pushed far beyond what their teachers had achieved. Claire continued the presentation and showed orbital weapons platforms that could crack planets by setting cup resonance patterns in a world's core, and she showed fighter craft that could travel through dimensions that most species did not even know existed, and she showed defensive shields that redirected incoming fire into pocket dimensions where the energy simply vanished into nothing. Every system was more advanced than anything the Stellar Academic Council had in their own arsenals, and every system used that same brutal efficiency that characterized human thinking, because humans did not care about elegant solutions or beautiful mathematics, and they only cared about what worked and what gave them an advantage in combat. Velshara finally found her voice and demanded to know why humanity had hidden all of this technology, and why they had let the Council believe they were primitive newcomers who barely understood the basics of spaceflight. And her silver eyes blazed with anger because she felt manipulated and deceived. Claire turned to face her fully, and the calm expression on the human woman's face shifted slightly to show something harder underneath, like steel beneath silk, and she explained that humanity wanted to know how the Council treated species they considered beneath them, and now they knew the answer. The human explained that Earth had sent several diplomatic missions to Council worlds before this examination, and those diplomats had watched and listened and learned how the elder races spoke about younger species, and what they had heard was not encouraging, because the Council talked about primitive species the way farmers might talk about livestock. Humanity had heard Council members discussing which primitive worlds had resources worth taking, and which species might be useful as labor forces once they were properly educated and controlled. And the humans had realized that the Stellar Academic Council was not the benevolent organization it claimed to be, but was actually an empire that used pretty words to hide its true nature. So, humanity had made a decision, and they had decided to hide their real capabilities and present themselves as naive and primitive while they built up their military forces in secret and prepared for the day when the Council would show its true face. And that day had arrived when Velshara had rejected humanity's application for advancement. Claire said that humanity did not want war with the Council, because war was terrible and destructive and caused suffering for everyone involved, but humanity would not accept being treated as inferior or being exploited by elder races who thought their age gave them the right to rule over younger species. Velsha felt Ashenter's presence in her mind, and the dragon's thoughts were troubled because he had lived for 6,000 years and had seen many civilizations rise and fall, and he recognized that humans had the determined mindset of survivors who would do whatever was necessary to protect themselves and their way of life. The elf woman looked at all the holographic displays surrounding them and saw decades of human research and development and military planning, and she realized that humanity had been preparing for this confrontation from the moment they had achieved faster than light travel and had made contact with the wider galaxy. Claire pulled up one final display, and this one showed strategic planning documents that outlined how Humanity would respond to various scenarios if the Council rejected them or threatened them, and Velshara read through the plans with mounting dread because humans had thought of everything. There were contingency plans for limited conflicts and plans for total war and plans for guerrilla campaigns that could last decades and plans for diplomatic solutions if the Council proved willing to negotiate as equals, and every plan was detailed and thorough and showed the kind of strategic thinking that most species only developed after centuries of warfare. Avelsha asked how many ships humanity had built in secret while pretending to be primitive, and Claire smiled slightly and said that she could not reveal exact numbers, but humanity had enough ships to defend Earth and the other human colonies, and enough firepower to make any attack on human territory extremely costly for the attacker. Examination chamber felt smaller now, with all the holographic displays filling it with light and information, and Velshara realized that she had made a terrible mistake when she had dismissed humanity as primitive, because they were not primitive at all, and they were dangerous in ways that the Council had never encountered before. Most species that achieved spaceflight did so after reaching a level of social development that made large-scale warfare uncommon, and those species approached galactic politics with caution and respect for the established order. But humanity was different, because humans had achieved spaceflight while still being fractured into competing nations, and they had brought their talent for warfare with them to thee. Star Sashenter spoke directly to Claire for the first time, and his mental voice was respectful rather than threatening, and he said that the dragon understood what humans were and why they were dangerous, and he asked what humanity wanted from this meeting. Claire's answer was simple, and she said that humanity wanted to be left alone to develop at their own pace, without interference from the Council, and they wanted the Council to change its policies about evaluating and controlling younger species. And if the Council could agree to those terms, then humanity would share some of its technology and help protect other species from being exploited. But if the Council refused and tried to force humanity to submit, then humans would fight. And they would fight with every weapon and strategy they had developed, and they would not stop fighting until either humanity was destroyed or the Council collapsed. And Claire delivered this ultimatum in the same calm voice she had used throughout the entire meeting. Velshira looked at this young human woman who carried the fate of her entire species on her shoulders and saw determination that reminded her of the ancient warrior races that had existed before the Council brought its version of peace to the galaxy, and those warrior races had been terrifying and powerful, and the Council had spent centuries subduing them. Now, here was humanity presenting that same warrior spirit combined with advanced technology and strategic brilliance, and Velshara knew that the AS Council faced a choice that would shape the future of the entire galaxy. She told Claire that she would take this information back to the ASEAT Council leadership and present it to them, along with her recommendation, and Claire asked what that recommendation would. Velshara was silent for a long moment before answering, because she had to choose between supporting the system she had served for 3,000 years and acknowledging a truth that made her uncomfortable. And finally she said that she would recommend negotiation, because the alternative was a war that nobody could win. The Council leadership did not listen to Velshara's recommendation for negotiation, and instead, they saw humanity's revelation as a threat that needed to be crushed immediately before other young species got similar ideas about resisting Council authority. And within 3 days, the largest military fleet ever assembled in Galactic stood on the bridge of the flagship called Eternal Truth and watched as 500 warships from a dozen elder races gathered in formation around her vessel, and each ship represented centuries of technological advancement in military tradition, and together they formed an armada that had never been defeated. In battle. Shenter was beside her, and his massive form barely fit in the bridge observation area, and his scales were dim with worry. The dragon had a bad feeling about this conflict, and he had learned over 6,000 for years to trust those instincts, but the Council had overruled all objections and ordered the fleet to proceed. The fleet commander was an ancient being named Crystallix, who had a body made of living crystal that refracted light into rainbow patterns, and he had commanded fleets for 2,000 years. and never lost a battle, and his confidence filled the bridge like a physical presence when he announced that humanity would be taught a lesson. They would never forget. Velshara wanted to argue, but she knew it would do no good because the council had made its decision, and now events would unfold according to their own logic, and all she could do was watch and hope that the cost would not be too high. The fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system and immediately began scanning for human vessels and defensive positions. What they found seemed to confirm the Council's view that this would be an easy victory, because the human fleet consisted of only 70 ships compared to the Council's 500. Crystallix ordered the fleet to advance in standard battle formation, which was a configuration that had been perfected over millennia of warfare, and placed the most powerful ships at the center with support vessels surrounding them in protective layers, and the formation moved forward. Like a vast predator approaching its prey, the human fleet did not retreat or scatter like most outmatched forces would do, and instead they held position near the orbit of Mars and waited with their weapons powered down and their shields at minimal strength. And this confused the Council commanders, because it seemed like humans were not even going to try to defend themselves then. Battle began, and everything the Council thought they knew about warfare became useless in the span of 30 seconds. The human ships flickered and vanished from normal space using the dimensional travel technology that Claire had shown Velshara, and when they reappeared, they were scattered throughout the Council formation instead of being in front of it, and this meant that the Council's careful defensive arrangements were now completely compromised. Human weapons fired before the Council ships could react, and those weapons used principles that violated several laws of physics that the Council had considered absolute and certain, and the effects were devastating beyond anything Shara had witnessed in her 3,000 years of life. One Council battleship simply ceased to exist when a human weapon created a localized space where time moved so fast that the ship aged into dust in microseconds, and another battleship was torn apart when gravity wells opened inside its hull and ripped it in different directions simultaneously. And a third battleship vanished into a pocket dimension and would never be seen again. Shantir roared in shock and fear as the bridge shook from impacts that should not have been possible, because human weapons were punching through shields that had been designed to stop anything the elder races could throw at them, and the dragon's mental voice filled with recognition as he realized what was happening. Humans fought like the ancient races from before the Council existed, and they fought like species that had built their entire civilization around the concept of warfare, and they used tactics that were considered barbaric and dishonorable by modern galactic standards, but were terrifyingly effective in actual combat. The Council fleet tried to reform and respond, but human ships kept flickering in and out of normal space and attacking from impossible angles and directions, and every time the Council focused their fire on a human vessel, that ship would vanish into another dimension and reappear somewhere else completely unharmed. Velsha watched the tactical displays with growing horror as the numbers told a story that should have been impossible, and Council ships were being destroyed or disabled at a rate of 5 for every human ship lost, in the battle that was supposed to be an easy lesson in Council superiority had turned into a massacre of the Council flight. Crystallix tried every formation and tactic that had worked in previous battles over his 2,000 years of command, but nothing worked against human warfare, and the crystal being's confidence cracked and shattered like his own body might under sufficient stress, and he began giving orders that contradicted each other and showed rising panic. 6 hours into the battle, the Council fleet had lost 300 ships, either destroyed completely or damaged so badly they could not continue fighting, and the human fleet had lost only 19 vessels, and those 19 had been destroyed only because they had stayed in normal space too long while rescuing escape pods from damaged Council ships. Velshara realized that humans were being gentle and were actually trying to minimize Council casualties even while defending themselves. And this made her feel shame, because the Council had come here to crush humanity and subjugate them, and instead humans were showing mercy to an enemy that had shown them. Non-Asian Tor's mental voice was quiet when he spoke to Velshara and said that this was what happened when old empires forgot that there were always younger and hungrier powers waiting to challenge them, and the Council had grown comfortable and complacent after 3,000 years of unchallenged relay transmission. came through from Earth, and the main view screen showed Claire, Martina, standing in what looked like a military command center with displays and officers moving behind her, and her calm expression had not changed, but her voice carried new weight. When she spoke, she said that humanity had warned the Council to turn the page and see what humans were really capable of, but the Council had not listened and had responded with violence instead, and now the Council was learning the hard way what humanity looked like when forced to defend itself. Claire continued and said that what the Council had just experienced was humanity being gentle and showing restraint because humans did not actually want to destroy the elder races and did not want to cause unnecessary suffering, but if the Council forced humanity into total war, then humans would stop holding back. She explained that humanity had weapons they had not yet used, and tactics they had not yet deployed, and capabilities that would shock even the most advanced elder races, and these weapons included things that could ignite stars and turn them into bombs and ships, could travel through higher dimensions that most species could not even perceive the human woman on. The screen looked directly at the camera and seemed to be looking into Velshara's eyes when she delivered her final statement, and said that the Council needed to stand down immediately and begin negotiations in good faith, or else they would learn what total war really meant when humans stopped caring about minimizing casualties. The transmission ended, and the Bridge of Eternal Truth was silent except for alarms and damage reports from other ships in the fleet, and Crystallix sat in his command chair with light refracting through his crystal form and scattered broken patterns that showed his shattered confidensive. She made a decision that would probably end her career with the Council, but she did not care anymore because she had seen enough death and destruction for one day, and she walked to the communication station and opened a channel to all remaining Council ships. Her voice rang out with authority when she ordered all Council vessels to cease fire immediately and begin withdrawing from Earth's solar system, and she said that anyone who disobeyed this order would answer to her personally, and since she was one of the most respected members of the Council, her word carried weight even in this moment of chaos. Crystallix tried to object, but Ashanter moved between the Crystal Commander and Velshara, and the dragon's presence made it clear that he supported the elfwoman's decision, and nobody wanted to challenge an ancient dragon who had decided where his loyalty. The Council fleet began withdrawing, and human ships escorted them to the edge of the solar system, but did not attack, and this small mercy somehow made the defeat feel even worse because it showed that humans could have destroyed the entire fleet if they had wanted to, but had chosen not to. Velshara looked at Earth, hanging in space like a blue jewel, and wondered what other secrets humanity was hiding, and what the galaxy would look like now that the Council's authority had been shattered by a species that was barely 300 years old. The Council fortress world called Sanctuary had existed for 3,000 years as the capital of the Stellar Academic Council, and it had never been attacked because everyone knew that such an attack would be suicide, and the world was protected by defensive systems built by 100 elder races working together, and by fleets that guarded every approach, and by ancient wards that bent reality itself around the planet. Humanity cracked those shields in 40 minutes using weapons and tactics that nobody had predicted, and the attack came so fast that the Council barely had time to realize what was happening before human ships were in orbit and targeting the Council chambers. Them Sylvesvelshire stood in the Great Hall, where the Council leadership met, and all around her the most powerful beings in the galaxy were arguing and panicking in equal measure, and some wanted to surrender immediately, while others demanded that the Council fight to the last breath, and still others were trying to figure out how to escape before the humans decided to start destroying things. Shanter was beside Velshara, and his scales had lost their usual shimmer and were dim with worry, because the dragon could sense that this was a turning point in galactic history, and what happened in the next few hours would determine whether the Council survived or fell, and whether a new age of chaos began. The first teacher, who was the eldest and most respected member of the Council, called for order, and his voice still carried authority, even though his many eyes showed fear that he was trying to hide, and he demanded that someone explain how primitive humans had managed to accomplish what should have been impossible. If Elsier spoke up, and her voice was steady despite the chaos around her. and she said that humans were not primitive and had never been primitive, and the council had made the mistake of judging them based on age rather than capability, and that mistake had led to everything that was happening now. She explained that humanity had developed advanced warfare over thousands of years on their own planet, and had refined their tactics through countless conflicts, and had learned to turn every setback into a lesson. That made them stronger, and when humans finally reached space, they had brought all that knowledge with them. Council had assumed that young species would be grateful for guidance from elder races and would accept whatever terms the council offered, but humans had looked at the council and seen not benevolent teachers but potential threats, and so they had prepared accordingly. Council members shouted that this was impossible and that no species could advance so quickly, but Velshara reminded them that they had all seen the recordings from the battle. Kea had all read the reports about human technology, and the evidence was clear, even if they did not want to accept it. Tushantar added his voice to the discussion, and his mental presence filled the chamber when he spoke and said that he had lived for 6,000 years and had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, and he had seen this pattern before when old empires became so confident in their power that they stopped paying attention to potential threats. The dragon explained that humans fought not for glory or conquest, but for survival, for the right to exist on their own terms, and such enemies could not be defeated through conventional warfare because they would rather die than submit, and they would use every weapon and tactic available to them, no matter how desperate or extreme. A council member, whose body was made of living flame, asked what Ashantar thought the council should do, and the dragon's answer was simple and direct, and he said that the council had two choices, which were to negotiate with humanity as equals, or to fight a war of extinction that would destroy both sides. Velsira supported the dragon's assessment, and added that she had studied human history during the journey back from Earth after the failed examination, and what she had learned was both frightening and impressive, because humanity had survived ice ages and plagues and countless wars and had emerged stronger from each challenge. She told the council that humans had a saying about learning from mistakes, and the saying was that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it, and the council was about to repeat the mistake that had destroyed previous galactic empires by underestimating a determined enemy. The first teacher looked old and tired when he asked what terms humanity would accept if the council agreed to negotiate, and Velshara said that she did not know for certain, but based on her conversations with Claire Martinez, she believed humans wanted three things. First, humanity wanted to be left alone to develop at their own pace without council interference, and second, they wanted the council to change its policies about evaluating and controlling younger species, and third, they wanted protection for other vulnerable species, so the council could not simply shift its attention to easier targets. Several council members objected and said that accepting these terms would mean the end of the council's authority and the beginning of chaos, as every young species demanded the same treatment. But Velshara pointed out that the council's authority was already gone, because it had been based on military superiority that no longer existed. Dashantor rumbled in agreement and said that authority based only on force was fragile and temporary, and true authority came from wisdom and fairness and earning the respect of those you led rather than demanding their obedience through threats. The debate continued for hours with different council members proposing various solutions and compromises, but the reality was that humanity held all the advantages now, and the council could either negotiate in good faith or face complete destruction. Then a new transmission arrived from Earth, and this time it was not Claire Martinez, but a different human woman who introduced herself as Lucy Hayes, and said she was Earth's diplomatic envoy, and she had been authorized to discuss terms with the council if they were willing to talk. Lucy's message was direct and left no room for misinterpretation, and she said that humanity understood the council was meeting to decide their response and wanted to make the situation perfectly clear before any decisions were made. Explained that human ships were currently in position around Sanctuary and around 17 other major council worlds, and that these ships carried weapons that could devastate planets if humanity chose to use them, but humans did not want to use those weapons because destroying worlds served no purpose except causing suffering. The human diplomat continued and said that humanity had spent months planning for this moment and had considered every possible council response and had prepared countermeasures for each one, and there was no military solution that would work in the council's favor. Lucy said that Earth was offering one chance for peace, and the terms were simple. And the council would recognize humanity as an equal power and would reform its policies about younger species and would work with humanity to create a new system where species were judged by their capabilities rather than their age. If the council accepted these terms, then humanity would share technology and provide protection for vulnerable species and work toward building a better galactic community. But if the council refused, then humanity would dismantle the council by force and build a new system anyway, except that version would cost millions of lives. The transmission ended, and the council chamber was silent except for the sound of distant alarms that reminded everyone that human ships were still in orbit overhead and could attack at any moment. The first teacher looked at Velshara and asked for her honest recommendation as someone who had spent time with humans and had studied their history and culture, and Velshara took a deep breath before answering, because what she was about to say would change everything. She said that the council should accept humanity's terms, not because they had no choice, although that was true, but because the terms were actually reasonable and would create a better system than the one that currently existed, and the council had grown corrupt over centuries of unchallenged. Our Velshara continued and said that she had spent 3,000 years believing the council was right and just and benevolent, but her encounter with humanity had shown her that the council had become the very thing it claimed to oppose, which was an empire that exploited weaker species. The elf woman's voice was steady when she said that humanity had not failed the examination at all, and instead, the examination had failed humanity by judging them according to outdated criteria that measured elegance over effectiveness and tradition over innovation. Ashenter added that this was the council's opportunity to evolve and become something better, and if they rejected this opportunity, then they deserved whatever fate humanity delivered to them. The vote was close, but eventually the council agreed to negotiate, and Velshara felt relief wash over her, because it meant that maybe the galaxy could avoid total war, and maybe something better could be built from the ruins of the old system. 3 months passed after the council agreed to negotiate with humanity, and during that time the entire structure of galactic politics shifted and changed in ways that nobody had predicted, and Velshara found herself spending most of those months on Earth helping to facilitate discussions between human leaders and council representatives. She stood now in a small garden behind the building that humans called their United Nations headquarters, and the garden was peaceful with flowering plants and trees that reminded her of the forests on her homeworld, and Ashenter lay nearby, enjoying the warmth of Earth's yellow sun, which was different from the blue suns that most elder races preferred. Claire Martinez sat across from Velshara at a simple table drinking something called coffee, which humans seemed to consume in large quantities, and the human woman looked relaxed and happy, which was very different from the tense confrontation they had experienced during the examination months. Velshara asked if Claire had known how everything would end when she first sat down for that examination, and the human woman thought about the question before answering and said that humanity had hoped for peace but had prepared for war because that was simply the human way of approaching any uncertain situation. Claire explained that throughout human history the most successful leaders and nations were the ones who hoped for the best outcomes but planned for the worst possibilities, and this philosophy had served humanity well when dealing with the council. Velshara mentioned that the council was going through massive restructuring, and the old system of absolute authority over younger species was being dismantled and replaced with something more democratic where every species had a voice regardless of age, and this was causing chaos on many worlds. Some species were happy about the changes and saw them as long overdue reforms that would make the galaxy more fair, but other species were terrified because the old system had provided stability, even if that stability came at the cost of freedom, and now nobody was sure what would happen. Next, Claire asked if Velshara thought the chaos was good or bad, and the elf woman smiled slightly and said it was both, because change was never simple or easy, and there would be problems and conflicts as everyone adjusted to the new reality. but ultimately the new system would be better than the old Ani Ashantur's mental. Voice joined the conversation, and the dragon said with amusement that humanity had appended a system that had lasted 3,000 years, and now the entire galaxy was watching to see what humans would do with their newfound power and influence. Claire said that humanity planned to keep learning and keep growing and keep making mistakes and fixing them, because that was what humans did, and she acknowledged that humans were not perfect and would probably make many errors as they took on more responsibility in galactic affairs, but she added that humans would also defend not just Earth but any species that the Council or other powers might try to exploit, and that was humanity's price for standing down and not pushing their military advantage further, and they wanted protection for vulnerable species built into the new system. Volshara said that humanity had turned from students being tested to teachers, instructing the entire galaxy, and the lesson they had taught was one that the Council desperately needed to learn, which was that age and tradition did not automatically confer wisdom or authority. Claire smiled and said that maybe humanity had just shown everyone that there was more than one way to solve problems, and the elegant equations that elder races preferred worked well, but the chaotic calculations that humans used also worked, and the universe was big enough for both approaches. The conversation turned to practical matters, and Velshara explained that many Council species wanted to establish diplomatic relations with Earth, and some wanted to trade for human technology, and others wanted military alliances, and humanity was suddenly the most popular species in the galaxy. Claire said that Earth was being careful about who they formed relationships with, because humans had learned through bitter experience that not everyone who smiled and offered friendship actually had good intentions, and humanity would take time to evaluate potential partners before committing to anything. Goshentere rumbled with approval at this cautious approach and said that wisdom often came from making mistakes and learning from them, and humanity seemed to have learned that particular lesson very well over their history. Velsha asked what Claire thought would happen over the next century as the new galactic system developed, and the human woman considered the question carefully before answering. She said that there would probably be conflicts and disagreements as different species adjusted to having real power instead of just following Council directives, and some species would handle the transition better than others, and humanity would need to help maintain stability during the difficult period. But Claire also believed that ultimately the galaxy would be better off with a system where species were judged by their capabilities and character rather than their age, and where young civilizations had the same rights and protections as ancient ones. Volshara agreed and added that she had spent 3,000 years serving the Council and believing in its mission. But now she realized that she had been serving a flawed system that needed to change, and she was grateful to humanity for forcing that change, even though the process had been violent and frightening. The elf woman said that when she first examined Claire and declared human mathematics incorrect, she had been so confident in her judgment and so certain that the Council's way was the only right way, but that confidence had been arrogance, and humanity had taught her. Humanity had taught her humility. Claire reached across the table and put her hand on Velshara's arm in a gesture of comfort, and said that everyone made mistakes, and what mattered was being willing to admit those mistakes and learn from them, and Velshara had done exactly that by recommending negotiation instead of continued war. Fashenter added his thoughts and said that the elf woman and the dragon had both grown from their encounter with humanity, and they had learned to question assumptions that they had held for thousands of years, and that kind of growth was valuable at any age. The three of them sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun move across the sky and listening to birds singing in the garden trees, and Velshara thought about how much had changed in just a few months. The galaxy that had seemed so stable and ordered when she conducted that examination was now in flux, with old power structures crumbling and new ones forming, and nobody knew exactly what shape things would take, but there was hope mixed in with the uncertain. Of sure remembered that moment when Claire had told her to turn the page, and she had been so confused about what that meant, but now she understood that it was about looking beyond surface appearances and outdated assumptions, and being willing to see things from a new perspective. The Council had failed humanity for incorrect mathematics, but humans had calmly said to turn the page, and when the council finally did, they discovered that humanity had been showing them old work while keeping their real capabilities hidden. It had been a test within a test, and the council had failed spectacularly by responding with arrogance and violence, instead of curiosity and respect, and now everyone was dealing with the consequences of that failure. But those consequences were not all bad, because the new system being built would give opportunities to species that had been held back by council policies and would allow innovation and creativity to flourish. Instead of being suppressed in favor of tradition, Claire stood and said she needed to get back to work because Earth's diplomatic corps was overwhelmed with requests and meetings, and humanity was still figuring out how to handle its new role in galactic affairs. Velshira and Ashentor stood as well, and the elf woman thanked Claire for her time and her patience in answering questions, and the human woman smiled and said they were all learning together, and that was exactly how it should be. Velshara prepared to leave Earth and return to her duties, helping with the council restructuring. She looked back at the garden one more time and thought about all the lessons she had learned. She had learned that wisdom could come from unexpected places, and that young civilizations could teach old ones, and that strength came in many forms, and that being willing to change was sometimes the bravest thing anyone could do. The galaxy had turned the page just as Claire had suggested, and the story being written now was one where humans and elves and dragons and all the countless species of the stars would write the next chapters together, not as rulers and subjects, but as equals and allies and fellow travelers trying to build something better than what had come before. Velshira smiled as she boarded her ship because she realized that failing that examination had been the best thing that could have happened, because it had set in motion events that would improve the entire galaxy. And as her ship lifted off from Earth and headed toward the stars, she thought about how a simple instruction to turn the page had changed everything and had taught her that sometimes the most important lessons came from the students we thought we were teaching.